Uh, Good afternoon, everyone. We opened the webinar. We are waiting an additional minute or so before starting to allow people to join, because I feel that people are still joining, and we start in 1 minute. I think we can start, perhaps. Okay, so good morning. No, good morning, good afternoon. It was a long day, but we are in the afternoon, everyone. My name is Roberto Florin. I'm the head of European Regional Hub of the Mixed Migration Center. And I'm very pleased to open this today webinar, where we'll be launching our latest report on the vulnerability and resilience to trafficking and exploitation among people fleeing Ukraine, a report which we published this morning, so is now available on our website. We are particularly proud of this research for a couple of reasons. It allows us to conduct research and engage with the topic of trafficking, which is sort of an emerging area of research at MMC. We believe that it is crucial to look closely at the risk of trafficking and exploitation, particularly in case of protracted displacement, and even for groups that enjoy relatively higher level of protection, if anything, compared to other groups like Ukrainian, because we know that vulnerability, trafficking, exploitation is something that tend to be hidden, and so it's extremely important to be paying attention to. Second, this research provides an interesting case study, offering insight into how legal pathways such as visa-free travel and rapid access to basic services and integration, like the Temporary Protection Directive, can impact vulnerability, in this case to trafficking and exploitation. So for all these reasons, we were very happy in 2022 to launch this report in collaboration with UNODC. Claire is with us today from the observatory. I'm going to introduce her later. And we did so with the support of the Swiss FDFA. They're also with us today, and Anna is going to speak after me. An additional contribution from FCDO and ANIDA, which we thank for the support. We had two phases. The first phase consisted in quantitative interviews in Bern, Berlin, and Warsaw, and a few key informal interviews. And these findings were published in 3 separate city reports in June 23, which are available on our website. And I see that the project manager of phase 1 is with us today, Maxime. So it's good. And thank you, Maxime. And then we had phase 2, which started in September last year. We consisted in more in-depth interview, like informal interview, specifically targeting individuals with direct experience or knowledge of trafficking cases to gather more detailed information, more granular information on the phenomenon, and also to see how it would evolve over time, because it spanned eventually 2 years, the project almost. Today, we are very proud to present the final report, which draw on the quantitative data from the 1,600 survey conducted during phase 1, and the qualitative insight from, in total, 57 key informal interviews conducted during both phases. And the report also includes 8 illustrative case studies. During today's webinar, we'll be focusing on, let's say, 3 key questions. The first is, what factor makes individuals displaced from Ukraine more vulnerable to trafficking and exploitation? How do financial pressure and language barrier contribute to these risks? The second is how have visa travel and temporary protection status in host country help build resilience for those fleeing the war in Ukraine, as mentioned earlier. And then finally, what role do social network, political will, and anti-trafficking measures play in protecting Ukrainian refugees? Before handing over to Anna for some opening remarks as well, some housekeeping rules. We invite participants to interact with each other via the chat box throughout the event. Please post any question in the question and answer box, and we will answer them as much as possible in writing during the event. And then directly later on after the panel conversation. After the panel discussion, during the Q&A, we'll also be taking live questions for participants. So if you'd like to speak, please raise your hand and you will be unmuted so that, and also allowed to turn your camera on. So with this, thank you again for joining us today. Look forward to the insight and discussion we'll be having around this pressing issue. And I'm now handing over to Anna Sandi from the Swiss Federal Department of Foreign Affairs, Human Rights Diplomacy Division, for some opening remarks. Anna, the floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you very much, Roberto, and good afternoon to all of you. I'm very delighted to be here and deliver some introductory remarks. First of all, of course, I would like to thank MMC for the webinar organized, and of course, all the important research work conducted. Special thanks to you, Julia, of course. And also, I would like to extend my thanks to UNODC, but also to all persons and organizations that have contributed to this study and to this important work. Switzerland is co-financing a broader project called the Rapid Assessment of Human Trafficking and Smuggling of Migrants in the context of the Ukrainian war. So also in this context, this study has been prepared. For the FDFA, so the Federal Department of Foreign Affairs, preventing and combating trafficking is a key priority in our human rights diplomacy, also given the fact that human trafficking is a serious violation of human rights and seriously affects also human dignity. And one of our main aims is really to promote a human rights-based approach when fighting human trafficking. And this, for example, involves focusing also on vulnerabilities, addressing vulnerabilities, and strengthening the rights of vulnerable persons and groups. But first, before we can address vulnerabilities, we also need to know which factors are at play. We need to have evidence. And so that's why it's so important that we have now this study. And I was very happy to see that it's now published. And I really believe that it will be very important for policy making, but also for actually all actors that are engaged in the fight against trafficking. And it will be surely also important for further policy development. The findings of the study has shown that actually there has been a relatively low incidence of exploitation and trafficking among people fleeing the war in Ukraine. And also, according to the study, we have seen that this is, among others, due to legal pathways such as visa-free travel and also the granting of the temporary protection status, but also to other factors such as high solidarity and a strong anti-trafficking response. So even though these findings really suggest that we have probably taken the right measures and they were effective, however, we know that challenges still persist. And we also know that the situation now has changed. We see also that, for example, solidarity is also declining. We see that in the last couple of months, but also in the last year, new conflicts have emerged that also attract political attention. I think this is a very important factor. So this is really also a sign not only to say, okay, we have done our job well, but it's really important to continue our efforts in preventing trafficking, but also in identifying victims, because I think it's reasonable to assume, even though that the study shows that there has been a low incidence of trafficking cases, there are still cases that have not been detected yet. So that's why really it's also important to step up our efforts in identifying victims, because when victims are not identified, they continue to suffer. They are not exceeding the rights they're entitled to, and perpetrators that just continue their business and go unpunished. So of course, states have the primary responsibility to fight trafficking, but also we have to do this like all together, like in a multi-stakeholder approach. This is very important, and we all know how important the contribution of civil society is in this regard. So in this spirit, I really also encourage us all that we continue here our commitments and continue all the efforts when preventing and fighting human trafficking, also in the specific context now of people in destination countries fleeing the war from Ukraine. And also encourage us to find responses that are based on human rights and also on a whole of society approach. So I wish you now a very fruitful exchange of views, a good webinar, and thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Anna, for setting the scene, also for the presentation to come. And now we will hand over to Julia Litsko, is a research officer at MMC Europe, who has been managing and coordinating the activity of phase 2 of the project, and then is the author of the report, and has the task of presenting the key finding in 15 minutes. Good luck, and the floor is yours, Julia.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Roberto, and thank you, Anna, for your very kind, welcoming remarks. And good afternoon, good morning, good evening, depending where you're joining from, to all the attendees. Today I'll be sharing, as Roberto said, the key findings from my research. I try to keep it kind of brief because I have 15 to 20 minutes, but I really hope it encourages you to go explore the full report after, and to go really and dive into it and look into all the findings. So first, I had wanted to say a few words about the background to the project, but Roberto and Anna already mentioned it. I won't go into, I'm not going to repeat it here now. But what I did want to highlight is that later this year, UNODC will also release a complementary report to the study that we're launching here today. And it will explore in more detail the survey data on the incidents and the broader trends on trafficking, legal frameworks related to trafficking and smuggling risks, in addition to in-depth case studies. So keep your eye out for that report that will follow later in the year, probably. So in today's presentation, I'll cover the key findings on the risk of exploitation and trafficking from our survey, and I'll talk about the vulnerability and resilience factors that we identified under this research, vulnerability and resilience factors to exploitation and trafficking. So since Russia's invasion of Ukraine in February 2022, there are now more than 6.1 million refugees registered across Europe, 6.1 million refugees who fled the war in Ukraine. And our study focuses on how this displacement has impacted vulnerability to trafficking and exploitation. And we focus on Berlin, Bern, and Warsaw, as Berlin and Warsaw host large refugee populations from Ukraine, and because of the three cities' sort of diverse context. And I wanted just to quickly also say a few words about what we mean when we talk about trafficking and exploitation. So trafficking in persons or human trafficking is defined under the UN Trafficking in Persons Protocol as the recruitment, transportation, or harboring of people through coercion, force, or deception for the purpose of exploitation. And this can include forced labor, sexual exploitation, or other types. And exploitation, on the other hand, is a much broader term. It refers to taking unjust advantage of someone for personal gain. And while trafficking always involves exploitation, not all cases of exploitation meet the sort of legal criteria for trafficking. Now I just want to say a few words about the methodology. Roberto already referenced it in his introductory remarks. So we used a phased mixed methods approach to this research. In phase 1, we conducted 1,600 surveys across the 3 cities. And we interviewed Ukrainian nationals and also non-Ukrainian nationals who had left Ukraine after February 2022 and had been settled in the city of interview for a minimum of 1 month. And we also conducted 28 key informant interviews. And then this year, in the phase 2, we conducted additional 24 key informant interviews. There was an assumption that there may be sort of delayed vulnerability, so that certain risks may continue to emerge over time. And we wanted to better understand the indications of exploitation and trafficking that we had already captured in phase 1 of the project. It's important to note that our findings offer important insight, but due to the sampling approach, they're only indicative and not fully representative. Access to non-Ukrainian nationals was also limited. And given the very sensitive nature of the research, some cases of exploitation and trafficking are likely to be underreported. The sort of ethical safeguards around this research were co-developed by UNODC and MMC, ensuring a do not harm approach by maintaining anonymity, allowing participants to opt out at any time on specific questions of the survey. And the survey itself focused rather on the identification of risk factors and general questions around experiencing or witnessing these. And the data collection teams were trained in how to refer people in need of assistance. Very briefly, also a note about our sample. Our respondents were predominantly women, with the majority aged between 25 and 44. And most of the respondents were Ukrainian nationals who held a temporary protection status in Germany or Poland, or in Switzerland, the equivalent status, which is called the S status, which gave them access to basic services and legal employment in the host countries. So the legal framework for refugees from Ukraine arriving in the EU is quite distinct, and it's different in significant ways from the framework that applies to refugees, asylum seekers, and migrants from non-EU countries. So now let's look at some of the key findings. So these general findings on risk of exploitation and trafficking that I will briefly go over now, they will be explored in much more detail in the forthcoming UNODC report that I mentioned. But I'm referencing them here, and they're also referenced in our study because we need them for context when we speak about vulnerability and resilience. So we asked survey respondents about problems or challenges that they experienced or witnessed in the city of interview, and the response options included indicators that are often associated with trafficking in person. And we found that 9% of the, so in general, 9% of the survey respondents, 138 people, reported encountering or witnessing issues related to worker housing. And most of these issues were reported in Warsaw, followed by Bern and Berlin. And the most commonly reported problems involve difficulties finding accommodation or experiencing discrimination in the workplace. And then going further into these responses, 6% of respondents reported some type of abuse in the workplace, and 2% of respondents, that's 35 people, reported encountering or witnessing potential cases of trafficking for forced labor. And those cases involved wage theft, deception about the work or the employer, excessive working hours, or unsafe working conditions. And the majority of people interviewed who reported this type of incident were surveyed in Warsaw. And our key informants confirmed this sort of relatively low incidence of trafficking for forced labor among people who fled the war in Ukraine. However, they did report widespread violation of labor laws, such as unpaid wages, poor working conditions, particularly in high-risk sectors like domestic work, cleaning, factory work. A very small percentage of survey respondents mentioned instances of sex work or prostitution, with 7 respondents believing that they had witnessed forced prostitution, mainly in Warsaw. However, it's important to note that none of the respondents reported personal experience of sexual exploitation, and this could, of course, also be due to stigma or fear of consequences, which may have led to underreporting. So in summary, what we see here from these findings is that among our survey respondents who were surveyed in early 2023, instances of potential forced labor and labor trafficking were reported at relatively low levels. And this was confirmed by our key informants and largely attributed to the refugee response by European countries, maintaining visa-free entry and facilitating very rapid access to temporary protection or equivalent legal residence statuses like we see in Switzerland. However, there may be many reasons for non-reporting, underreporting, or sort of delayed reporting of trafficking cases. And cases may still come to light and risks remain, particularly when certain vulnerability factors intersect. So before we kind of dive into what these vulnerability factors are that we identified under the research, I wanted to say just a few sentences about our conceptual model. So our research is grounded in this conceptual framework adapted from the Interagency Coordination Group Against Trafficking in Persons. And this framework is valuable in many different ways. It highlights the intersectionality of vulnerability factors and shows how different factors can combine to increase risks for certain persons. And it also recognizes that vulnerability is not static. It can shift depending on evolving personal, situational, contextual factors. And of course, none of these factors alone that I will mention necessarily have to make an individual vulnerable to trafficking and exploitation, but especially in combination with other factors, it can increase risk. So let's dive into those findings. Economic hardship was identified as a significant factor of vulnerability under this research. And we found that while social benefits play an important role in helping Ukrainians cope with financial pressure, those benefits also vary across the 3 cities that we studied. And our survey data points to a lack of financial stability in all the 3 locations. So in fact, 44% of respondents in Berlin and Bern and 43% of respondents in Warsaw reported that their financial situation only partially meets their covers their household needs. And limited access connected to this, limited access to decent work due to language barriers and lack of recognition of qualification was another major risk factor. And this causes many to work in lower skilled, informal or insecure employment where it becomes much harder to assert rights, which can increase risk of exploitation. And our survey also highlights this issue with 86% of respondents in Berlin, 80% in Bern and 67% in Warsaw, who cited language as the biggest barrier to finding decent employment. And key informants in Berlin and Warsaw especially also stressed that these language barriers, they don't just affect the type of jobs refugees can access, but they also limit people's ability to understand employment contracts, to navigate legal protections, and to seek help when they are faced with exploitative conditions. Additionally, we found that respondents had to show considerable flexibility in finding work, with many having to shift sectors entirely after leaving Ukraine. So for example, in Berlin, we had 27% of respondents who reported working in the domestic or cleaning sector, compared to only 3% who carried out this work previously in Ukraine. And to sort of illustrate this point, I want to tell you about a Ukrainian man that we interviewed who fled to Warsaw with his family. And despite having 24 years of medical experience, including as a paramedic, his qualifications were not recognized. And when he finally secured a job at a hospital in Warsaw, he was hired as an orderly, which is sort of like a cleaning staff, let's say, yeah, something like this. So he was hired as an orderly, and he ended up working 12-hour shifts for minimum wage without proper breaks under a Polish civil law contract, which is a special type of contract in Poland that doesn't afford the same rights, the same labor protections as a regular type of contract. And then linked to this issue also, we identified that many refugees are unfamiliar with the local labor laws, which can make them more vulnerable. It was also mentioned that some individuals who fled Ukraine, they may be used to the sort of gray area of Ukraine's labor market, where jobs are not always fully compliant with labor laws. So many may be simply unaware of their rights and the legal protections that are available to them. However, we were also told that some people are quite aware that they might enter potentially exploitative conditions, including being paid less than other people that work there, et cetera, but they see no choice but to accept this job that is available to them. In Warsaw, we found that this issue is further complicated by the widespread use of the civil law contract that I mentioned, which lack many of the protections that are offered by regular employment contracts. And particularly in Poland and Germany, the issue of not being fully familiar with local labor laws is often worsened by labor intermediaries who place refugees in certain jobs with minimal oversight and protection. So for example, in Berlin, we heard of a Ukrainian man who was employed by a subcontractor for a major logistics company. Like many other careers, he worked quite long hours, up to 12 hours a day, 6 days a week, and he was paid based on the number of parcels he delivered, not the amount of time that he worked. And as a result, his earnings sometimes dropped as low as 4 euros per hour, which is well below Germany's minimum wage. And he wasn't aware of his rights, and he only realized sort of the extent of his unpayment after he calculated his wages. But he lacked sort of the knowledge and about the legal protections which were available to him until he was referred to an advice center in Berlin. We also found that access to secure housing remains a major challenge for people displaced from Ukraine, which adds sort of another layer of vulnerability. And while private housing schemes have been very welcome and largely an expression of solidarity, they also led to situations where some hosts took advantage of the dependency of refugees, which resulted in cases of labor exploitation and sexual abuse, especially in the early days when the reception systems were overwhelmed. Collective accommodation centers, though somehow a necessary solution, presented their own set of challenges, and poor living conditions, security risks, and instances of discrimination, particularly against marginalized groups like the Roma community, were reported. And key informants also highlighted that refugees living in employer-provided housing are particularly vulnerable, and their dependence on accommodation makes them less likely to report abuse, as they might fear eviction or homelessness.
Julia, 5 minutes to 20.
5 minutes, okay. I'll go quick over these last ones. Additionally, we found that many, particularly non-Ukrainian third country nationals and Ukrainian Roma, they face significant hurdles and discrimination in accessing temporary protection status, which made them potentially more vulnerable to exploitation as they were cut off from social support. And others may face bureaucratic obstacles, especially for those arriving without documentation or those engaging in pendular movements between Ukraine and host countries. Further, we were told that growing negative perceptions of Ukrainian refugees and host communities, particularly in Warsaw and Berlin, where large numbers of Ukrainians reside, can increase people's vulnerability For example, in Warsaw, many locals perceive Ukrainians as competing for jobs and social benefits, which can lead to tension and a decline in social solidarity, which can make people hesitant to voice complaints or to seek help because they fear backlash. Here, very briefly, we also identified some groups who can become more vulnerable under certain circumstances, including women, children, the elderly, people with disabilities, Ukrainian Roma, and non-Ukrainian nationals. But it's important to recognize that none of these groups are inherently vulnerable. It's just under certain circumstances, they can be more vulnerable than others. So while we've now explored these vulnerability factors that can put people who fled the war in Ukraine at risk of exploitation and trafficking, it's really important to recognize that there were a lot of factors that have quite successfully contributed to their resilience. So I'll just go briefly over two. So overwhelmingly, we were told that visa-free travel and access to temporary protection status have been critical in reducing the risk of exploitation and trafficking. The availability of legal pathways for travel has significantly decreased the need for smuggling and irregular border crossings, providing much safer options for travel. And our survey showed that the vast majority of respondents in Bern, Berlin, and Warsaw did not pay anyone to cross the border illegally. Additionally, the very rapid access to legal status under the Temporary Protection Directive ensures that refugees can enter the labor market and access social benefits, which reduces their vulnerability. And key informants also highlighted that legal status helps individuals leave abusive situations without the fear of losing their residency, which provides them with more freedom to seek better opportunities. And these protective measures are particularly important for minimizing those dependencies that can lead to higher risks of trafficking and exploitation. And further, another big factor was anti-trafficking responses from national and local authorities, as well as civil societies that have played a really critical role in reducing risks for those who fled the war. And these efforts mobilized really quickly in 2022, and then they involved a wide range of preventative and support measures, flyers being handed out at train stations, flyers being posted in collective accommodations, official websites being translated into Ukrainian and Russian that warn of risk of exploitation. So there was a very, very wide variety of measures, protective measures that were put in place. And lastly, we found that social support networks within the Ukrainian community also play a crucial role in building resilience. But I think I'm out of time. I'll just share my closing remarks quickly. So in conclusion, what we see here is that what we found with the study is that measures like visa-free travel and temporary protection or equivalent statuses have been crucial, really, in safeguarding many of those fleeing Ukraine. And they seem to have significantly reduced instances of smuggling and trafficking based on the data that we analyzed in this research. However, our research also underscores that we need to continue monitoring the situation and to continue to invest in protective measures, especially as the displacement situation risks becoming protracted and vulnerabilities remain. So thank you so much for your attention, and I look forward to discussing the findings.
Impressively 20 sharp minutes, so very well done, and thank you for the very good presentation, very clear as far as I'm concerned at least, but we shall see later during the conversation. I noticed that we start receiving a few questions. We received one question in the question and answer, which is good. Please do continue putting your question in the question and answer so that we can answer, as I said earlier, either in writing or later. Question could be for Julia, but also for the panelists. Since we are entering now into the panel conversation. So we have with us today 4 panelists with whom we want to continue the discussion and conversation. We have Dr. Claire Healy, which is a research officer at the UNODC Crime Research Section, where she coordinates the UNODC Observatory on Smuggling of Migrants. She conducted research on trafficking in person and migrant smuggling, previously also with the ICNPD, where we had the pleasure to work as colleagues. Welcome, Claire. And of course, she was very much involved in this research too, because this was a partnership with UNODC. So welcome, Claire. Then we have Anna Geller, who is a child protection technical advisor at Save the Children Poland, formerly protection manager at the Danish Refugee Council. And she authored a few key protection analyses on the challenges faced by Ukrainian refugees in Poland. Then we have Yücel Meroglu, who is a research officer at the German Center documenting anti-Roma discrimination. Her work includes monitoring incidents, advising affected individuals, and authoring reports such as the anti-Roma discrimination against Ukrainian Roma refugees in Germany. Welcome. And last but not least, we have Lena Krylova, who is an international development consultant with 20 years of experience. She's based in Bern. Following the Russian invasion of Ukraine, she co-founded Ukraine Spies Bern, an NGO supporting Ukrainian refugees in Bern and facilitating Swiss-Ukrainian exchange. And she also, her organization conducted the field work for phase 1. So they conducted a survey in Bern. So she has a very good insight into both the situation of Ukrainian in Bern, but also on the project. So welcome, Lena. So I'll start with a first round of questions for each panelist. I'll ask you to keep it to 5 minutes max, if you can, and then we open for question and answer. Please do to the public ask question as you go, and raise your hand if you want to add something or to ask a question live a bit later. So let me look for the questions. And we start with you, Claire. So as we have seen, our research indicate, and also as Anna mentioned at the beginning, a sort of relatively low incidence of smuggling and trafficking from Ukraine to and within Europe, which strongly suggests the effectiveness of legal pathways like the visa-free entry and rapid access to basic services and rights, which is the temporary protection directive. What do you think? What are, in your opinion, the implications of the Ukraine example for counter-smuggling and counter-trafficking responses more broadly? The floor is yours, 5 minutes.
Thank you, Roberto. And thank you to Mixed Migration Center for a great partnership as always, and also congratulations on this excellent research that you have presented. As Roberto and Julia mentioned, UNODC will be in the next, hopefully before the end of this year, publishing a separate study that uses a lot of this same primary field research to look very specifically at the precise incidence of trafficking in persons and of smuggling of migrants in this context. And I think this MMC report sets out very clearly the sort of vulnerabilities and resilience and what the broader context is. I think, you know, in answer to your question, it's quite rare and it's extremely welcome to conduct research into you know, quite a tragic conflict situation, and to find that in fact it does not seem to have resulted in a significant increase in trafficking in persons and indeed in smuggling of migrants. So that's a very interesting opportunity for us to reflect. The reasons for that, and I think in the context of other similar displacement crises and conflict-driven vulnerability, we have seen quite a different response in terms of the legal and policy framework. And I think you've addressed that quite well. So anyway, since 2017, Ukrainian citizens have been able to enter any country in Europe, with the exception of the UK, visa-free. And so what this meant quite specifically is that there was almost zero demand for migrant smugglers. There was no need to engage with migrant smugglers. There was no need more broadly to engage in sort of dangerous journeys that were irregular, because Ukrainians now, and we'll come to that hopefully, not everybody fleeing the war, but most Ukrainian citizens could then enter visa-free and not engage with smugglers. One aspect of that, though, that I think is worth dwelling on a little bit, and when Julia was presenting the vulnerable groups, I think it's important to add Ukrainian men between the ages of 18 and 60 to that group, or that category of vulnerable groups. And that's because where we did find some indication of smuggling, and as you presented, in Poland, for example, there was a higher number of, 10% of people who said that they did pay people to cross irregularly. Well, we work on the assumption that many of them, they may not even have been smuggled. They may not even have entered irregularly, entered a new country irregularly. The point is that they exited Ukraine irregularly because they were evading martial law prohibiting them from departing the country. And this has created very specific vulnerabilities, and in the tens of thousands of smuggling cases, as far as we can see. I mean, we'll have more detail in our report, but I think this is a specifically vulnerable group. If you look at the figures of people who have temporary protection in the European Union right now, the proportion among them of men has increased slightly. So we're looking at about 24% men, about 42% women, and the rest children. So I think that's a group that we need to take into account. But broadly, this visa-free travel has had a huge impact, because not only does that prevent irregular journeys and prevent smuggling in and of itself, but because people are not engaging with smugglers, because they're not embarking on irregular journeys, they are less vulnerable to being trafficked. And that's really clear. We've had previous research look into sort of the opposite scenario, where it is precisely those irregular journeys and engaging with smuggling that makes people vulnerable. So here, I think that point is made even more strongly, that luckily we finally have a counterexample where regular safe travel has broadly been possible for most people, and therefore we don't see high levels of trafficking. And maybe I'll finish on that with sort of the other piece of the puzzle, which is the context in receiving countries, where not only in EU countries applying the Temporary Protection Directive, but also, as we've seen in Switzerland with Temporary Protection S, in the UK with specific visas and specific residence status across European countries, including also Moldova and the neighboring countries. The Ukrainians and others have been able to very rapidly access a status. So they're not spending months in an asylum process, not being able to work and not being able to access education, social welfare, and so on. And then the sort of array of rights that temporary protection provides in pretty much every European country, so temporary protection, the equivalent, has really improved people's resilience. That's really clear. And when that's combined with the solidarity and the anti-trafficking measures that we spoke about, we see that it's a very effective response. I hope this isn't the last thing I'll say, because I don't want to give I don't want it open to being misinterpreted that everything's completely fine, but I think those are some of the lessons that we can draw.
Yeah, definitely going to be the last, because you reach your 5 minutes, but perfect timing. Thank you. But we hope we can continue in the question answer. Then thank you, Claire. We now move to Anna. So key informant from our research confirmed the relatively low incidence of trafficking for forced labor, as also just mentioned by Claire. On the other hand, they noted, and also the data confirmed, that quite widespread labor violation among refugees from Ukraine, and particularly in Warsaw. In your opinion, based on your recent experience, what vulnerabilities still exist for Ukrainian refugees, and non-Ukrainian in terms of exploitation, labor right violation, or precarious employment. Do you feel that there are some unique challenge or advantage that Ukrainian refugees face compared to other displaced population? The floor is yours, 5 minutes.
Thank you very much. So I was also asked to mention a bit of what of the vulnerability and resilience factors remain and what is changing. So I also want to highlight some issues that would be good to look at or look into as we move ahead, while we might not have evidence on this generated yet. So I would definitely stress the interconnection between accommodation and the need to generate income as a factor which exposes people to exploitation. There were also, in terms of Poland has its own national temporary protection legislation, which was recently changed as of July 1st. So it removes the allowance for hosting refugees from Ukraine, which on the one hand removes an incentive for engaging in exploitative practices, which we also have documented in the DRC protection monitoring reports. But the question is, will it increase the risk due to the fact that some people who were hosted free of charge now will have to contribute financially or find alternative places to live? And we know that the rental market in Poland is very difficult, in Warsaw in particular. The law introduces also the requirement for financial contribution among those who stay in collective accommodation sites. And the new addition is that now this financial contribution is also expected to be paid on behalf of children, which wasn't the case. And this is deducted directly from the childcare allowance, which is the only fixed allowance that Ukrainian parents would receive unless they have been granted some additional social safety nets, which is a very difficult process, whereas the child protection allowance is relatively easy to obtain. So that increases the financial pressure on households. And what Julia, you've also mentioned on the labor market in Poland pre-2022, we had already, in Poland, there was already a quite large Ukrainian diaspora, which was contributing to the Polish economy through employment. But there was a widespread acceptance for working irregularly, acceptance of labor exploitation. And the arrival of Ukrainian refugees was somehow built on that foundation, unfortunately. And also, I would say, no culture of looking at refugees from a rights-based perspective. So it was very often seen as charity, that giving people any job will be, or any income generation will be, should be appreciated instead of looking at it from the perspective of rights. So there's also a very limited access to remedy. And I would say here language also interplays with that. So language does act very strongly as a protective factor, which for Warsaw or for Poland might be a bit easier considering the language similarities among Polish and Ukrainian. But what we see as a vulnerability factor is definitely belonging to minorities. So we see a high risk for Roma refugees, especially also among children who are put often in exploitative labor practices. But also in terms of age, we look at teenagers. From the age of 16, teenagers are allowed to work part-time in Poland, but we also see the pressure on many teenagers to contribute to the income of the household, especially if they stay in a single-headed household. But also we see more and more care leavers. So children who turn 18 become adults and are either have to leave foster care arrangements, also sometimes which are family-based. And if they have some family networks, they can rely on them. But if we talk about children who are in institutional care, they have very, very little to no support, which also puts them in a situation of potential exploitation. And here I also wanted to mention that this is anecdotal right now, but NGOs in Poland start also observing irregular arrivals of adolescent boys and young adults who try to flee from the from the conscription, and they're also a highly vulnerable group. And another group which we see as highly vulnerable are persons belonging to the LGBTQIA plus groups. There's forthcoming research of an organization called Queer Without Border, which also talks about the distinct risk of exploitation and trafficking towards these groups. So I just want to draw your attention to that. What we also see is that a contributing factor is the limited recognition of professional certification that's limited to just a few health professions, which also often puts people in a vicious cycle where they work low-paid jobs and therefore are unable to invest into having their certificates or professional certification recognized in Poland. Another thing is the profile of jobs, and I just want to reference a UNHCR Deloitte report, which indicates that while 5% of the overall people employed in Poland work in what is called elementary occupation, it is 40% of Ukrainian refugees right now, which also shows the mismatch between the profile of the jobs, but also in terms of smaller towns, the availability. But I think also what we see is that in terms of the resilience, the support networks play a critical and crucial role, but also the easy access to territory and the very supportive legal framework, which provides immediate access to the labor market. And that shows how much legal protection matters, because Poland is also a place which deals with another humanitarian crisis, a crisis which affects people who try to seek asylum in the EU and who enter irregularly via the border with Belarus. Vast majority of them are not white. They come from Middle Eastern and African countries. If they apply for asylum, they have to wait a minimum of 6 months until they can undertake some work or employment. If they are migrants, the legality of their stay is strictly connected to a work permit, which is issued by based on the request of a particular employer, which creates dependency, which can also be very easily abused.
If I can ask you to very kindly try to wrap up, thank you.
Good.
Then we can continue the conversation, I hope.
Sure. So I will just to finalize with one reflection is that very often in Poland, the discourse around migration and refugee rights is oriented towards the needs of the labor market. And even attempts to foster social cohesion are done through showcasing refugees' economic contribution. And I think that there is an implied message, what is that message when it comes to protection of human rights, if we look at it only from the perspective of the needs of the labor market. Thank you.
Thanks. Yeah, you really put a lot of sort of thought-provoking reflection together. Besides important to look at the context, yeah, and then we see really the granularity of each and every context and the impact that this had on vulnerable population. You already sort of, together with Claire, also answered a question that was in the question answer about specific challenge for a young adult. So thank you for that, and thank you also for the question. The issue of double standard between treatment of Ukrainian versus other, which is of course something very important, and also the link that exists between protection, integration, and then actual needs of the market, and then which one is the one that is determining the course of action. Yeah, the ideal scenario that goes hand in hand and it's a win-win-win, but we know that is not often the case. Somehow linked to this is the question for our third panelist, Yujel. So Ukrainian Roma face unique vulnerability both during their journey and upon arrival in host countries. Often encounter discrimination, difficulty accessing the EU Temporary Protection Directive, lack of access to basic services, and social exclusion. So can you elaborate on this factor and how this vulnerability from the point of displacement to integration in host country exacerbate the risk of exploitation? 5 minutes. Eugene.
Okay, thank you. Yes, indeed, there are several factors which contributes to the vulnerability of Ukrainian Roma refugees and which presents their equal participation in German society. And the underlying reason for this is often the structural lack of their basic rights is it's not only that they are a racialized group, but also the century-old anti-Gypsyism as a specific form of racism and which is really deeply rooted in Germany. First of all, I would like to highlight here primarily one main point, and it is related directly to the legal status. As we all know, the EU Temporary Protection Directive applies to all Ukrainian citizens, but the granting of this status to as Roma labeled refugees from the Ukraine is since the beginning of the war in 2022 a big challenge. Since the arrival of the first Roma refugees from the Ukraine, there derived discussions about there were widespread rumors which constructed them as fake war refugees, which need no protection either. Later, this construction resulted in publicly discourse about Roma that is lasting until now. It consists of the generalized accusation that their immigration, which is always portrayed as an invasion of big, large families as clans, is intended to systematically exploit the German welfare state. The central aspect of this anti-Gypsy discourse is the fundamental questioning of the Ukrainian citizenship, and thus also the deserving of protection status. Due to that discourse, some federal states like Baden-Württemberg and Bavaria tried to deny particularly refugees with a dual citizenship, Ukrainian-Hungarian, a protection status. They are to be excluded from the residence permit in accordance with paragraph 24 Aufenthaltsgesetz by means of a critical examination and then denying their refugee status and depriving them of all support linked to this for example, social benefits. This procedure is based on an anti-Gypsy's views that accuses the refugees of social fraud, as they would conceal their dual citizenship according to the administrative authorities, or even they say that Roma use forged passports or illegally obtained real passports, which they present to the administrative authorities. Another suspect indicator, according to the administrative authorities, is that they speak, they say it almost exclusively Ukrainian or Russian. And this is enough to suspect these persons labeled as Roma. This criminalizing practice, which is, one must say, based solely on mistrust, ultimately means that refugee Roma families are not granted temporary protection under Section 24 of the Residence Act, and therefore have no access to social assistances. This, in turn, leads those affected into an really emergency situation in which they are left without any help and are forced even to return to the war zone in the worst case scenario. For example, we had an incident. We received a desperate call from a Ukrainian Roma family who were in Germany and in acute need. They had several children and received no financial help. They had no papers and no accommodation. There are also another incidents, but I will explain the situation shortly, very short. The fact that such a public propaganda can quickly turn anti-Gypsy's mobilization is regularly demonstrated by the activities of right-wing and extremist group. These groups pick up such anti-Gypsy's discourse and agitate against them. Besides the fragile legal protection and such administrative practices, there are also other vulnerability factors which became evident in the last 2 years. This applies to almost all areas of life, and such as accommodation, access to housing, healthcare, education, and others. Like I said, due to the short time I would like to only summarize these aspects. In the area of housing, for example, Roma often have to live in collective or segregated accommodation, or even in tents or emergency shelters, even after 2 years, as they have to overcome major obstacles to find decentralized housings, unlike white Ukrainians. Refusals are also widespread in places where there's sufficient housing opportunities. In some federal states, the accommodation itself are often very poorly equipped in remote locations with poor infrastructure, and there are hardly any offers. And the second aspect, yes, the poor housing situation of many refugees has thus a direct impact on their living conditions, such as in the area of schooling for children. For example, there have been and still are incidents in which the situation has served as justification for withholding a school place from the children, because they say there are simply no school facilities near the accommodation, or the schools are too far away. Especially at the beginning of the refugee migration, Ukrainian Roma children had to wait months for a school place. The problem of non-schooling still exists in some federal states. So it is clear that all these problems exacerbate the risk of exploitation. The lack of basic rights make Ukrainian refugees of Roma ethnicity potentially more vulnerable to exploitation and trafficking in informal work arrangements. Yes.
Thank you, Jugel, for this sobering reminder of the disparity of treatment for some specific population. So I think that, yeah, the last two intervention nuance as much as we needed your sort of positive picture at the beginning of this conversation, Claire. Yeah, by highlighting some specific vulnerability, specific challenges for specific population in specific context, which again highlight the importance of the context and of the details and of the granularity in looking at the issue of traffic exploitation, which is something, as I said at the beginning, which tend to be a bit hidden sometimes and not as visible as other protection concerns. On this note, and to close the panel before opening, I'm very happy to be asking you, Lena, something also based a bit on your direct experience as working for this NGO in Bern, but also, as I said at the beginning, as the organization that has conducted field work for phase 1. So, following the Russian invasion in 22, you decided to support more directly establishing this NGO, Ukraine Space Bern, to facilitate the integration of Ukrainian refugees in the canton of Bern. And your NGO carried out the data collection for our project. Can you tell us, please, how the research finding and also a bit what you heard from our panelists just now go along with your experience and observation of the key challenges Ukrainians face in Bern and in Switzerland more in general, if you can, and also perhaps something on key resilience factor that and vulnerability that have persisted throughout the displacement crisis and how you see them developing over time. The floor is yours, 5 minutes.
Thank you very much. Well, thank you very much for all these interesting panel inputs. I think that most of these trends you were talking about, to a different extent, but we see them for sure in Switzerland. I would probably start with saying that Switzerland or Ukrainian refugees in Switzerland have been pretty privileged compared maybe to those in Germany and Poland, because the social package and support they received here has been more generous. We're discussing now, for instance, the issue of employment quite extensively, because Switzerland is tightening the policies and strategies and pushing Ukrainians to employment, and we see why. It's difficult now after 2 years, year and a half of dependencies from many, to shift to getting to work. But maybe I will just concentrate more on how things changed or evolved in the last year and a half, 2 years, and talk a little bit about the resilience factors and innovations here, and then the vulnerabilities shifts as we see them mainly through our work, through practical work that we do with refugees. And as you mentioned before, we support quite a lot. Well, we have several projects with women and young people, but also elderly, and we work on social integration in the centers, collective accommodation centers. What we see here is, in terms of resilience factors, there is more clarity definitely about the status S and the implications in terms of protection and rights it implies. If in the beginning there were quite a lot of confusions, now I think there's a lot of also information sources and information support available also to the newcomers, to the newcoming refugees. We also see across different cantons support services evolving from language courses to psychosocial support, all sort of courses explaining how the education system works, what's the employment path, etc., etc. And now late down the road, but still the federal government and the canton picked it up in terms of implementation, has launched so-called Program S, which is oriented now towards integration of Ukrainian refugees into the labor market and employment. And there is a whole area of measures which also stimulate social workers and agencies involved in administering social packages for Ukrainians, which motivates them to push Ukrainians into to go for work. Definitely, Ukrainian community is much better organized. We see a lot of local initiative groups, also NGOs evolving almost in each canton, psychosocial support, mutual support groups, Ukrainians being organized around churches, although also around Russian Orthodox Church. We have also this. Multiple social media channels in the support of Ukrainians by locations and by themes. So that's pretty there. And we also, on the background of this, we also see, I think, more cleavages now based on language, regional origin from Ukraine, ethnic, religious differences, and of course, I mean, Roma is a special case here. Those people who came earlier definitely, I mean, had an opportunity to use the benefits that were provided in terms of studying the language, integration support in terms of the labor market, etc. And those, I guess, who were very determined to stay from the beginning, they used this chance, and we see very good cases of integration in different terms. We also see people integrating quite rapidly in rural communities, where community is smaller, and then people rely on social networks and relations to particular people, and then the local Gemeinde or community administration supports them if they got a positive image. And we see definitely rapid integration of children and youth that went through the education institutions in the last 2 years. Then, if I talk about vulnerability shifts, definitely the issue of the status S. I think Switzerland was quite late in the process after EU to prolong the status S. And also we see the practical difficulties with finding employment, longer term, accommodation, longer term, etc. whenever a person with status S pops up. There are discussions about benefiting, about possibility to grant status B or to apply for status B for Ukrainians after 5 years of status S. But this is a longer-term perspective and something under discussion now. Definitely, we see that there are bleaker return perspectives for refugees from occupied and destroyed territories. The more destruction is happening in areas like Kharkiv, for instance, less people from these areas think that they will be returning, and now they start also relativating, so to say, their integration strategies. Definitely employment difficulties connected to language, especially for those who haven't used this opportunity in the last 1 year, 2 years, and thought, okay, we're staying for 3 months, and 6 months, 1 year, and then I'm back. Now it's not reality. People stay longer, but language courses are not any longer supported. Unless people show that they're determined to find or they are close to finding a job. Or studying opportunities. There's definitely job skills mismatch, and then many Ukrainians are being denied jobs based on the argument of overqualification. The issue of diploma approval, then temporary statuses, which I mentioned before. And then also we see as a tendency reluctance of Ukrainians to invest in some cases in starting career from the bottom. Although now the working permit is simplified, the employers are being also encouraged to take Ukrainians more on a long-term and short-term work. There's also quite a number of cases, and I mean, when there's a negative case, it's always on the social media, and it's being known next day about any negative experience in employment, which is linked to either legal ignorance of people who went to informal relations with employer, or lower payment or unpaid work. We also see that Ukrainian refugees are increasingly pushed to get employment or to study in spheres where Switzerland has a deficit of working force. And this is usually less attractive status, less attractive wages, and still requires, for instance, like in flagging and care sector, still requires requalification and starting from the bottom. And this is especially obvious among young graduates and youth that is not studying anywhere here in Switzerland or already not studying in Ukraine. Yes, I talked already about the social. So the generous social package, it still exists, and most of the cantons, despite of the push and different incentives for Ukrainians to get to employment. The issue of the public image is probably also among vulnerability shifts or factors now, because there's much more in media we see it, and in discussions among the Swiss community, there's much more negative images of non-integration rather than positive integration. So positive integration happens, but it's silent, it's modest, etc. We hear much less about it. Plus, of course, it is the Russian propaganda, which is done very systematically in German-speaking countries, adds to this, and the state administration publishes openly the budget statistics, and we see also how much expenditure goes to support of the Ukrainian refugees, and this all leads to all the political debates regarding tightening policy and radical measures. For instance, well, 2 examples of things that are being discussed in the Swiss Parliament. One is the return of people from more safer regions to Ukraine, or, for instance, cutting on ability to travel for Ukrainians back to Ukraine. So we will have quite a number of discussions now in the Parliament in the next 2 months on this sort of issues. Then there is a tendency of refusal to grant status S to Ukrainians refugees that are relocating from other EU countries. I mean, we know this is a general trend, and we have more and more also young people who are coming to reunite with their families, or they think that they have more opportunities to study in Switzerland that are denied the status. Another thing, last point, maybe.
Thank you.
Is the lack, and we're discussing that increasingly now also with the Swiss government, lack of reintegration strategies or thinking for Ukrainians. And there's more and more voices coming from Ukraine talking about return of youth, and labor need for rebuilding Ukraine. There are single examples of special programs, but there is no systemic thinking on that yet. So this is probably also one of the important vulnerability factor for those families. And we see at least 30% that those are determined to return to Ukraine. Thank you.
Thanks. Again, a lot of information. Thank you. I do think that quite a few of your points you raised, they're specific to the context in Switzerland, which is specific because of the specificity of Switzerland being a non-EU country. But they probably resonate also with people that are more familiar with other contexts. I'm thinking about, for instance, the challenges for the long-term integration. I remember when we conducted the study and we published it in June last year. Back then, we could see how sort of initial wave of people, quite a few managed to integrate quite quickly, whereas others, they were taking more time. And then the projection was that they needed to learn the language and have their qualification recognized so as to be able to enter in their sector of expertise. And basically, we are now realizing today that this takes longer than 1 year. Sometimes takes actually quite longer than that, because people as if they have to restart from scratch. And of course, this is at the same time probably a good news, because it means that people are given a proper opportunity for a second chance. On the other hand, it poses challenges because the integration does not happen as quickly as it was expected and planned for in terms of social support and so on and so forth. So thank you for that. Now, we still have 15 minutes more or less left for question and answer. I do invite participants to raise their hand if they want to ask a question. Also, if they want to complement what we've been discussing, as long as you can keep it brief. Meantime, we have one question in the question answer that we can ask. Perhaps, Julia, if you want to start addressing, and then if panelists also want to add something. So is Maria, and you excuse me how they pronounce your family name, Stankiewicz, if you is asking if do you ascribe the disparity, so to what you attribute or how you justify, if you like, the disparity in number of responses regarding sexual assault and forced labor between the 3 different cities. So if you can start, Julia, and perhaps other panelists want to complement.
Yeah, perfect. Thanks, Roberto. I'll try my best and then others can come in. But I would say in terms of the difference in the number of forced labor or abuses in the workplace between the city, it likely comes down to a few reasons, and some panelists have already touched on it also in their intervention. But I think it mainly comes down to the fact that the local conditions vary. So for example, in Warsaw, where we have seen identified through the survey the highest number of potential incidents of forced labor, the social benefits are much less than in Berlin and in Bern. And it likely means that people have to seek employment very quickly and much more quickly than in the other cities. And additionally, there may be more cases where people work under less secure conditions and less secure contracts, which makes them more vulnerable. And then in Berlin and Bern, it seems that there's been a more sort of delayed entry into the labor market of people who fled the war in Ukraine. And in Bern specifically, stronger labor protections may have helped to reduce these risks. Yeah, I would say that's on potential cases of forced labor exploitation. And regarding sexual exploitation, I don't have a very definitive answer. To be honest, I think really cultural factor stigma affect how willing people are to report this type of issue. It's a very sensitive issue. And even in our survey, we found that only 7 people reported that they had believed that people were in situations of forced prostitution, which they had witnessed. So, and 6 of these occurred in Warsaw. I think it's difficult to draw a conclusion there because of that we assume there's high likelihood of underreporting. But we did hear from key informants that they noted across the 3 cities, mainly in Berlin, actually. We heard from key informants mentioning instances of Ukrainian women engaging in prostitution where there were potential situations that indicated high vulnerability. But you need much more detail to identify that. I think that's kind of my initial reflection on that. And I was hoping Claire would complement.
And Claire seems to be willing to complement because she raised her hand. I didn't know that panelists can raise their hand. Yes.
Thank you.
You're given the floor, Claire.
No, just to briefly add to that, because it's an important point. I mean, the 3 cities that we looked at, that we conducted field research in, Berlin, Warsaw, and Bern, are actually all contexts where sex work is legalized under certain circumstances. So where it's registered and, you know, there's a procedure for doing it legally. Now that procedure is quite sort of clear and open, and you apply for a certificate in Berlin. However, there are very low numbers of people who have actually done so. And I think we saw indications in all 3 of the cities of women who had fled Ukraine becoming involved in prostitution and sex work. And as Julia said, some indications of very high levels of vulnerability. But we didn't see, and I think that's very interesting in this sort of regional and international policy context to discuss, is that prior to 2022, relatively high numbers of Ukrainian women were identified as victims of trafficking for sexual exploitation in various different countries and regions around the world. That has, if anything, slightly declined, so that the trafficking cases that we have seen since 2022 are mainly forced labor. So it's really interesting to note that these more severe cases involving more organized groups as traffickers of exploitation of Ukrainian women seem to have, if anything, declined. Obviously, we wouldn't get that much information in surveys about that, but even talking to civil society organizations on the ground who have been working on this topic for some time, they said they've actually seen a reduction. One possible explanation for that is that Ukrainian women who prior to, so in a sort of a perverse development, Ukrainian women who prior to the full-scale invasion had more precarious legal status, were more likely to be trafficked for sexual exploitation. There were more criminal groups active in that field. Since the full-scale invasion in 2022, they have a less precarious status. They can access temporary protection, and there's sort of less opportunities for those criminal groups. But that is something that still needs to be further investigated to better understand. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you, Claire. We now have Justina, to which I'm going to give the floor in a second. But she just, can you raise your hand again, Justina, so that I can allow you to speak? I think if I do this, you should be able now to speak, unless I'm mistaken. You can also put your camera on, perhaps.
Hello. I
Hello?
cannot see any icon for the camera, unfortunately, but
we
I
can
can
hear you.
Okay, cool. Great. So that's cool. So thank you once again for presenting the very interesting findings and for all the discussion. It was really informative. I can share with you actually 2 things. One is based, I should probably have introduced myself. I'm analyst working in ACAPS, Ukraine Analysis Hub. We are like analytical entity also. But I will share my experience from like my previous workplace, which was for both University of Warsaw and Warsaw School of Economics, where we conducted some studies on refugees and their reception in Poland, but also through different aspects of this reception. And one of them was, of course, like access to the labor market, employment opportunities, and so on. And we also did interviews with entrepreneurs. And I think that it was particularly striking, like this approach of entrepreneurs. I'm not talking about like specific locations, because the study was conducted in locations other than Warsaw, actually, but it was something that was shared by entrepreneurs. Like their approach to treatment of foreigners. These were not only refugees, but general foreigners, and to like the approach to treatment them as more like as labor force than people, and exploiting, you know, the situation of their maybe lack of full rights, of some weaknesses that they experience, was really striking. And I think that maybe if there is anything that could be like more done on this subject, I think that this is like something that is still lacking, the shift of the approach of entrepreneurs to the situation in the labor market, and to the situation of increase in the numbers of, you know, potential employers. And I'm talking about foreigners, I'm talking about refugees from Ukraine, but also from other countries. And another issue is about vulnerabilities, and like what we can see when we look more closely into like factors for vulnerability. So we did the study in ACAPS in Ukraine. We searched we tried to identify all vulnerabilities that we could find in all affected population groups, and that were prone to some protection risk all over Ukraine. And the striking was that the groups are more or less similar to the ones identified in your study, which also shows that like some vulnerabilities that were, for example, experienced by people in Ukraine or in their host, destination, but countries of origin, are still or can still reappear in their destination countries or host countries. So that,
if you don't mind to wrap up in a few
yes,
seconds,
of course.
we just want to give the chance to the panelists for final
yes, of course.
remark, and we have 2 minutes to close. Thank you.
Thank you. Just a closing sentence, that what really was also striking in our study, that the importance of geographic locations of people, of their like geographic like oblast of origins and so on. It was really like important where they did come from, whether it was occupied territory, whether it was territory or oblast near to the front line, or somewhere in the center of the country or in the west. So it was also important. Thank you.
Thank you.
That's all.
Thank you very much, Justina, for your remark. We have a question. I'm afraid it's a bit too late to answer that. We can try to answer in writing. I just wanted to try something because we have 2 minutes left. I just want to ask a last question to all panelists, but if you can answer in 30 seconds so that we can all speak before closing. Anna at the beginning mentioned something about solidarity fatigue and a context, international context with emerging instability and conflict, which lead to a scarcity of resources and also scarcity of attention span. How concerned you are from your perspective about the impact that this could have on the specific support for Ukrainian? From your perspective, 30 seconds, I'll be very rude and interrupt you after 30 seconds. We can start in inverse order. Lena.
Yep. Well, yes, as I mentioned already, we are expecting quite a number of decisions to be made in the parliament in Switzerland in a couple of months with regards to what would be the support package for Ukrainian refugees in the coming year, and then how the stimulation of shifting to work will evolve. And indeed, solidarity fatigue in this discussion is very much reflected.
Thank you.
It seems we have lost Roberto, but I just hand over the floor to Anna and then see if he can rejoin us.
I'm back.
Oh, you're back.
But are we still on? Yes.
Yeah.
So sorry, something happened to my UGL.
Yes, I'm not sure whether I have understood the question right, but I will try to answer the question very quickly. I'm very pessimistic because, yeah, unfortunately for the Roma, my refugees, there were never a solidarity act of solidarity in Germany, and now we are in times of political crisis and fragility. You know, the AfD as a rising political power in Germany. Yeah, there are lack of many resources, and also I don't believe that I'm honest that the German government has really an honest interest to integrate the Roma refugees in Germany. And we are observing that many refugees are going back to the war zone because of the precarious situation for Roma refugees in Germany.
Thank you, Yujel. I think you actually very much
Yeah.
answered to my question very convincingly. So thank you for that. And Anna, 30 seconds, and then Claire, so that we can close within a decent delay. We're already 2 minutes past and people are leaving.
So I think that it's important to monitor the impact of the changes in the temporary protection of Poland, especially related to persons staying in collective accommodation sites, and the impact of the payment for the stay of children. But also I would look at teenagers, because also Poland introduced the obligatory enrollment in schools, and the peer pressure around having certain items and being able to afford certain things can have an impact on teenagers. And again, as also was mentioned, I would still look at the situation of men and LGBTQIA+ persons.
Thank you, Anna and Claire.
Yeah, I can only second and third and fourth what the other panelists have said about continuing to observe the situation of minorities and looking at issues in the labor market and so on. And it seems to be my role to sound an optimistic note. I think that what has been key is visa-free travel and is temporary protection. And I think that luckily, even if there are reductions in what temporary protection means, I think that that will, continue to be provided. And I don't think visa-free travel is going away. And I think that those are really not only important for this particular conflict, but it's a huge lesson, I think, for the international community on how to deal with refugee situations and ensure that people are in a position to be resilient themselves and not be always dependent on solidarity and state support. Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, it's always good to be able to close on a positive note. Not always easy, but thank you for successfully doing that. So thank you, panelists. Thank you, Julia. Thank you, participant. I know that we have a few questions in the question answer, but they came a bit late, so we are trying to answer in writing. We're going to share the recording of this webinar. We're going to share the link to the various reports. Thanks for staying. 32 of you past the time. I hope you find it interesting. Reach out if you have any question, and I wish you a very nice end of the day. Thank you all, and thank you, Julia.
Thank you all so much.
Thanks.
Take care. Have a good day. Thanks for joining.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.